and family crisis, to name just a few. The women who work at women's centres are, without question, each and every one of them highly skilled, knowledgeable, and committed to making a difference in their communities and in the lives of these women and girls. Yet they are underpaid, and there's no provision in the province for enabling salary increases. My question to the minister is, why hasn't the minister addressed the terrible underfunding of salaries for women's centre staff in this province?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I thank my honourable colleague for bringing this very serious matter to the floor. The women's centres across this province, Mr. Speaker, do a phenomenal job. They do provide programs and services, Mr. Speaker, for women, for young women, and certainly they're a very valuable resource in many communities across this province. They don't exist in every community, but certainly in the communities that have them, they certainly appreciate the programs and services they do provide. Mr. Speaker, there's no question that this government's commitment to those women's centres to increase their funding to $155,000 in core funding is proof positive. This government believes firmly in those women's centres and will continue to invest in them, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Halifax-Clayton Park on her first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to ask the minister whether or not she maintained that commitment in the last budget, because it's my understanding that that increase was promised in the last budget and that that has not come forward to the women's centres to date.
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and indeed I thank my honourable colleague for bringing the question forward. That money was committed, Mr. Speaker. This government stands by its commitments, Mr. Speaker, and we will continue to provide that core funding to each and every one of those women's centres, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Halifax-Clayton Park on her final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, there's clearly some confusion with Women's Centres Connect because they understood the money would be coming. I don't really want to hear about your commitments. I want to hear about whether the money is flowing to women's centres who are saving government a lot of money in the work that they do for very low salaries. It saves an awful lot of money for the rest of community services. Mr. Speaker, I would also like to ask the minister in her answer to address the issue of a number of cancelled meetings with Women's Centres Connect, the most recent of which was November 27th, and the women from Women's Centres Connect were told that they would have a meeting with the minister sometime in the new year. And that's not good enough, Mr. Speaker. We want to hear whether or not this government has a commitment and is standing behind the women's centres and the work that they do. So I would like the minister to speak about when she will meet the Women's Centres Connect and whether or not it's beyond a commitment and actual money is flowing to women's centres.
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. There's 2 or 3 answers in that question. I'm pleased to address each one of them. Mr. Speaker, there are 2 issues here. The core funding that the Department of Community Services pays, Mr. Speaker, each year. We increased that. It is $155,000 per centre, Mr. Speaker. That's core funding for each centre. That has been committed and that is being delivered, Mr. Speaker, in each budget year. Mr. Speaker, the other issue that my colleague raised regards salaries. And the salary issue is the question, Mr. Speaker, that I have discussed with the Women's Centre. Indeed, my entire caucus had a discussion and a presentation just last month, Mr. Speaker, from the Women's Centre Connect, the group all across the province. Yes, Mr. Speaker, I have committed to meeting with the chair of that committee. I will meet with her, Mr. Speaker, in the new year, in January, as soon as my schedule permits that, Mr. Speaker, to address the very serious concerns that they have.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Community Services. According to information obtained by my office, there are approximately 400 adults and children with disabilities who are waiting to enter supportive housing, small option homes, and group homes. Meanwhile, according to a recent Stats Canada report, 441 of the residents living in nursing homes are not seniors. In fact, many are under the age of 44 years old. These younger people are often put in nursing homes because community-based housing is not available. So I ask the Minister, when will the reviewing stop and more small option beds be put in place?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to rise and respond to my honourable colleague's question. I certainly am pleased to remind the House of some of the initiatives that we've put in place, Mr. Speaker, already regarding small option, Mr. Speaker, and regarding placement for persons with disabilities in this province. Shortly after becoming Minister, Mr. Speaker, we announced the 5-bed transition home in Dartmouth, Mr. Speaker, which allows for more of that transition to take place, Mr. Speaker. We have the Regional Rehab Centre at the old Cobequid site, Mr. Speaker, that is going to be able to provide another level of care, Mr. Speaker. Of course, we have the renovation at Riverview that I know my honourable colleague across the way is very pleased to have us move forward on. Of course, the 6-bed community home in Port Hawkesbury, along with the one on the South Shore, and indeed our commitment here in Halifax with the L'Arche communities, Mr. Speaker, as well as the expansion of the independent living support program, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable the Member for Dartmouth North on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, there are residents in nursing homes and institutions who can and should be living in our communities. The small options moratorium has created long and increasing wait lists for adults wanting to live in supportive housing. Meanwhile, some adults with disabilities or long-term mental health issues are forced to live in institutional settings because nothing else is out there for them. My question to the Minister, why does her department continue to force institutional living on so many disabled Nova Scotians?
The Honourable the Minister of Community Services.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, to my honourable colleague who brings the issue, Mr. Speaker, the commitment of this government for the expansion of the independent living support program, Mr. Speaker, along with those 6-bed homes, the community homes that we so proudly announced, Mr. Speaker, in Port Hawkesbury, the South Shore, and indeed the ringing endorsements that we've received from L'Arche Halifax, Mr. Speaker, as they move forward to establish their chapter here in Halifax. Again, proof positive that I, as Minister, and this government are committed to community living and quality community living for all Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable the Member for Dartmouth North on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, a nursing home is not an appropriate place for a young person to live. This province has failed to respect the wishes of persons with disabilities and their advocates to provide adequate community-based housing options. My question to the Minister of Community Services is, when will the continuous string of studies and consultations stop and action start?
The Honourable the Minister of Community Services.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And again, the long list of supports that this government has put into place, first and foremost, Mr. Speaker, to provide for the care of individuals in their community at that community level is proof, Mr. Speaker, in the homes that I mentioned earlier, Mr. Speaker, as well as those expanded independent programs. Yes, Mr. Speaker, we had a renewal project that was underway, Mr. Speaker, and that will be part of the budget process, and I look forward from the support of the Minister of Finance as we move forward in that budgetary process, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable the Member for Cole Harbour Eastern Passage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Education. During the recent by-election campaign in Cole Harbour Eastern Passage, candidates from all parties were in agreement on the major infrastructure needs in our communities, a high school for Eastern Passage area of the riding, and improved recreational and health facilities. So my question to the Minister of Education is this. Will a high school for the growing community of Eastern Passage be a high priority for this government?
The Honourable the Minister of Education. The Honourable the Minister of Education has the floor.
Mr. Speaker, to the member opposite, I want her to understand that the proper facilities for all students across the province are priorities for this department. As a result of that priority, we had set aside $400 million to address 57 communities. We do take our direction on capital construction from the school boards, and in the particular case of which she speaks, we have asked the school board to go out and provide with us a master plan that will look at accommodations facilities for all students on that side of the harbour.
The Honourable the Member for Cole Harbour Eastern Passage on her first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The need for a high school for Eastern Passage has been raised many times in this legislature, and I intend to continue to be a strong voice on this issue on behalf of the constituency. Mr. Speaker, the population of Eastern Passage and Cow Bay is nearly 13,000 and is growing. The need for a high school continues to grow. Mr. Speaker, 750 high school students leave the community every day to attend school outside of their community. In view of these facts, Mr. Speaker, my question is this. When will this government acknowledge this need so that Eastern Passage will finally get a high school?
The Honourable the Minister of Education.
Mr. Speaker, one of the reasons for asking for a master plan for all schools on that side of the harbour is because when we move the 700 students that the member speaks of out of one school, it certainly gives us excess capacity. And it's that whole issue of excess capacity and having the facilities built where the population exists is the challenge that's before the school board at this point.
The Honourable the Member for Cole Harbour, Eastern Passage, on her final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The government assures us that its programs and services are available in all constituencies across Nova Scotia. That's good to hear. But few communities have such a high need or have waited as long as Eastern Passage. My final question to the Minister of Education is this. Will she commit to announcing a new high school for Eastern Passage in the next fiscal year?
The Honourable the Minister of Education.
Mr. Speaker, for the member opposite, the process that's followed for announcing new schools or renovations is a capital construction process, and the recommendations come from school boards to a capital construction committee. They in turn give the minister a recommendation that goes before cabinet. We will follow that process.
The Honourable the Member for Clare.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question for the Minister of Transportation and Infrastructure Renewal. Mr. Speaker, in October 2002, the Matagan River Bridge in Clare was inspected by the Department of Transportation and was found to be in good condition. Less than 1 year later, the bridge collapsed. Fortunately, no one was injured, but it was a telltale sign that this bridge needed serious repair. And here we are, 4 years later, and a temporary bridge is still in place. So my first question to the Minister is, when will the department construct a permanent bridge for Matagan River?
The Honourable the Minister of Transportation and Infrastructure Renewal.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And as I mentioned in the House earlier this week, the issue around bridges is very important to this province and this government. The department has undertaken an assessment of bridges as a result of some actions that have happened in the past, and I know in this case, the honourable member brings forward an issue on behalf of his constituency, which I will certainly look into. I do want to remind the honourable member, I believe when the previous government was in place in the mid-90s, I know there was a temporary Bailey Bridge put in my area, I think probably in the 95, 96, which is still in place. And I think, Mr. Speaker, that we want to get by that, and we want to ensure that when we put temporary bridges in there, in fact, just that, temporary. And Mr. Speaker, I will certainly look into that on behalf of the honourable member and report back to him.
The Honourable the Member for Clare on his first supplementary.
Thank you. The people of Clare, Mr. Speaker, were told that the main deciding factor for replacing this temporary structure will be when funding becomes available. Now that the Conservative government has renamed its department to include infrastructure renewal, I think the residents in this area deserve to have this problem remedied and know when they can get a new bridge over this troubled water. So again, to the Minister is, does the Minister have some idea on when the residents of Clare may see this temporary bridge replaced?
The Honourable the Minister for Transportation and Infrastructure Renewal.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I certainly don't have the information at my fingertips the honourable member is asking about. I just finally have the information from yesterday that the honourable member, I believe, from Hants East and others asked, which I know the honourable member was hoping, it is Christmas, Mr. Speaker, and I wish I could fulfill his list, but unfortunately I can't today. But I will certainly get that information from the member and report to him as soon as possible.
The Honourable the Member for Clare on his final supplementary.
And I want to thank the Minister for his answer. Mr. Speaker, the temporary two-lane panel structure currently in place over the Matagan River has caused a lot of concern for local residents. This panel structure is a source of heavy noise, and residents believe that the loose surface panels themselves are causing part of this disruption. It's increasingly loud, and one resident has even described the noise as, and I quote, a gunshot sound. So my question to the Minister is, can the Minister inform the House on how often this bridge is inspected and how often work is carried out to tighten up these loose panels?
The Honourable the Minister of Transportation and Infrastructure Renewal.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I can tell the honourable member that bridges are inspected on an annual basis, and I will endeavour to have the bridge engineer do the inspection, or at least get the information the honourable member is asking about. But I can assure the honourable member that everything is done within transportation to ensure safety for all travelling motorists, and it certainly would be in the case of the honourable member's riding.
The Honourable the Member for Halifax Atlantic.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and my question is for the Minister of Tourism, Culture and Heritage. As the Minister knows,
Order, please.
the federal government is currently seeking a new home for the 15,000 pieces of the National Portrait Collection and has announced in November that it will entertain proposals from 9 Canadian cities, including Halifax. Other major centres like Vancouver and Calgary are aggressively bidding to host this national cultural resource. Halifax has said little or nothing, and the Minister has said even less. So I ask the Minister, why is the province not supporting Halifax as location for the National Portrait Gallery?
The Honourable the Minister of Tourism.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I must say that's not the question I had anticipated. But in saying that, I do have an answer. I do have an answer for the member across the way. It is wrong for her to stand in this House and say that the provincial government has not taken a stand. But, Mr. Speaker, experience will teach you that's the appropriate stand to take, and there's protocol to follow. This is a federal initiative, and the federal initiative states clearly, and I'm going to table the document that I just happen to have in anticipation that she may ask this question, Mr. Speaker, and it said that the federal government was putting an RFP out to the private sector, for the private sector for them to show interest. And once I table this, she can go out to the private sector and inform them of this information. And if they put a proposal, and present it to the Minister of Tourism, I would be happy and very pleased to review the proposal. And if, Mr. Speaker, and if everything is in line, of course, the Minister and the government would support a facility in Halifax. Thank you for your time, and I also would like to thank the member for the question, and I would table this document. Make sure it's the right one and not the question I thought she was going to ask.
The Honourable the Member for Halifax Atlantic on her first supplementary.
Speaker, and I'm astonished to understand that the province has not communicated with the private sector on this. However,
Order, please. The Honourable Member
somewhat
has the floor.
defeatist. In any case, the chair of HRM's Cultural Advisory Committee, not the private sector, says the committee would support an application by a local developer or the Art Gallery of Nova Scotia, but their stand is clear. It is up to the province to make this approach. It's obvious that for the region to put in a successful bid on this major national historic and artistic resource, the province must play some role, not a reactive one. My question to the Minister, time is running out, and why has his department not gotten involved?
The Honourable the Minister of Tourism.
Mr. Speaker, she's quite right. Time is running out. But, Mr. Speaker, as I said in my place here, that the government is supportive of the initiative, but protocol and proper process procedure has to follow. And I would want to share with the members in this House that this government is in conversation with our federal partners, unlike that group over there that may not necessarily be in communication with Jack Layton. Thank you very much.
The Honourable the Minister for Halifax Atlantic on her final supplementary.
Do you know?
Order, please.
I'll tell you, this sounds not like a culture of defeat, but potentially the defeat of culture in this province.
Order, please. The time for oral question period has elapsed. The Honourable the Minister of Economic Development.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. With the permission of the House, I would like to provide some clarity to numbers that I provided to the Leader of the Opposition during question period. And at that time, I indicated that NSBI had a $2.5 million exposure. They had, in fact, provided a guarantee for half of a $5 million loan, and some of that loan has since been paid down, so that now the exposure would be at a figure of $1.98 million.
The Honourable the Minister of Natural Resources on an introduction.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and it gives me great pleasure to recognize some friends from King South, namely that Valley Gem, the town of Wolfville, place the first free trade town in the country, a leader in smoke-free bylaws, an environmental role model, and home of the #1 undergraduate university in the country, Acadia. I would like to recognize, I want the members of the audience to understand what we have to put up with here. I mean, we all know Acadia is #1. Thank you for pointing that out, Bill. I would start by recognizing from the left, Roy Bordeaux, CAO for the town. Yes, if you could stand as I call your name, please. Councillor Rosemary Zagato, Councillor Hugh Simpson, Mayor Bob Stead, Smoke Free Kings Chair Doug Herget, and Deputy Mayor Bob Rye. If the host could please give them a warm welcome.
The Honourable the Minister of Finance on an introduction.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I too would like to make an introduction to someone who's in the House today, and that's Ms. Valerie Viva, who is just recently started in the Minister and Deputy's office at the Department of Finance, and she's in the House today, and I'd like her to rise and read the welcome to the House.
The Honourable the Government House Leader.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Proceeding with government business, I would move that you do now leave the chair and the House resolve itself into the Committee of the Whole House on bills.
All those in favour signify by saying aye. Aye. Against? Motion is carried.
Order, please. The Committee of the Whole House on Bill is now called to order. The Honourable the Government House Leader. The Deputy Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Would you please call Bill number 7, the Motor Vehicle Act?
Bill number 7, the Motor Vehicle Act. Last time when we adjourned the debate on Bill number 7, the honourable member from Halifax Needham had moved an amendment on clause number 13. The amendment is not in order. To delete a clause simply entails a vote against the clause itself. So the chair now recognizes the honourable member for Halifax Needham.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I accept the ruling of the chair with respect to the amendment that was moved, but I'd like to speak then against clause 13, which essentially was the purpose of the amendment. The purpose of the amendment was to delete clause 13, but as I understand, it's kind of redundant to move an amendment to delete a clause when procedurally the best way to delete a clause is to vote it down when it comes to a vote. So on behalf of the NDP caucus, let me be clear about what the concerns are with respect to clause 13, and let me be clear about what the government's intention is with clause 13. Clause 13 is the provision in Bill 7 that would introduce fines for people who are soliciting at intersections and on streets across the province. And this particular clause has sort of euphemistically become known as the squeegee kid clause or provisions in the bill. And the government have said that their concern is one of safety with respect to the safety of individuals being in the streets. And Mr. Chair, safety is a concern that we would all have with respect to people who may be on our streets or at our intersections. However, it has been pointed out throughout the various presentations and debate around this bill and this particular provision that the incidence of anybody having been struck or injured at intersections in the process of squeegeeing or standing there with signs asking for change or support are simply not there. We've seen the government have brought forward no evidence, no statistical information, no record of incidents. And in fact, as I understand the presentations in front of the Law Amendments Committee from some of the Safety Council groups, they came here to speak to other provisions in Bill 7, which they supported with respect to photo radar or the prohibition on the use of cell phones and what have you, which are also part of Bill 7. But they had no opinion. They did not express support for this particular provision. And these are organizations, independent, arm's-length organizations in our community that are very concerned about road safety and crosswalk safety and what have you. And I found the lack of the lack of analysis and intervention from these groups very telling, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Chair. And I think it may very much suggest that this is not a priority issue for them. It is not an issue that they perceive as a safety issue, and in fact they steer away from it because they understand that underpinning this particular clause is concern about social problems and the politics of what some people would consider poor bashing, Mr. Chair. The government made, I think, a very big point in the speech from the throne about talking about safer and healthier communities. And they put forward ideas that they had about the things that they could do, more things they could do to make our communities safer and healthier. This particular provision wasn't part of what was in the speech from the throne, as best as I can tell, unless parts of that speech were written in code, which is sometimes the case, we find out later on when we see legislation that comes forward. But Mr. Speaker, they did, in the speech from the throne, recognize the work and the initiatives of people who are working to address many issues in our community, including the push for affordable housing, to make more spaces available for those in need of a place to call home. And Mr. Speaker, I would suggest to the members of the government and other members here in the legislature that many of the people who we find at our intersections are in fact homeless or living in shelters, living in inadequate and substandard housing, living in slum housing and overcrowded situations, couch surfing, crashing with friends, and even strangers because they're unable to afford a permanent, secure, safe, decent place to live. And the government are to be congratulated for talking about affordable housing in the speech from the throne. But in that document, they identify a gentleman who lives in my constituency, Wayne McNaughton, who lives in shelters and has lived in shelters for many years, who has become a housing activist and advocate. And I know that, I believe that the Minister of Community Services made reference to Mr. McNaughton and his work. They said they were listening to people like Mr. McNaughton about the solutions that are required. And I know that the Premier has received a letter from Mr. McNaughton, and in fact letters are coming forward from a number of people in our community who are all too familiar with issues of poverty and housing and homelessness, and why we have the squeegee kid and the situation at intersection where people are looking for change in the first place. And people like Mr. McNaughton are very, very, very disappointed in this government for this piece of legislation, specifically this provision on this provision here, Clause 13. And Mr. Speaker, or Mr. Chair, rather, I have a letter that I will table to the Premier from Mr. McNaughton, who was, again, named in the government's speech from the throne on page 18 with respect to affordable housing. And he has written the Premier about his concerns around Bill 7. And he has also indicated that he has very serious reservations about the poverty reduction strategy of the government. He points out the contradictions, Mr. Speaker. If on the one hand saying you're going to develop a poverty reduction strategy working group, and at the same time you're criminalizing the most poor and marginalized and disadvantaged members of our community at the same time. So, Mr. Chair, I'd be happy to table a copy of Mr. McNaughton's letter to the Premier because I think members of the Assembly might be very interested in seeing what Mr. McNaughton has to say. And as I said, Mr. Chair, Mr. McNaughton is somebody who was singled out by the government as someone who, and the Minister of Community Services just says, he does great things, and he has worked very, very hard to advance the interests of people who live on the margins in our province. Mr. Speaker, as I said earlier in this debate, and I think at the beginning of this bill being brought back for Committee of the Whole, I don't think anybody would argue, I certainly wouldn't argue, I've spent too long as a social worker working in the community with groups trying hard to find solutions to inadequate resources and poverty. I would certainly never argue that begging on street corners is the kind of public policy response that I think serves people who are poor well. It certainly doesn't serve people who are poor well. But the solution is not to levy fines. I don't care if the fine is $250 or $50. The solution is not to criminalize and penalize and label as deviant or antisocial the kinds of activities that people adopt as survival strategies when they are very poor. And this happens all too often in our society, I'm afraid, Mr. Speaker. Rather than work with various community groups, church-based groups, and other organizations that deal with poverty and disadvantage and develop reasonable solutions, we have a government that focuses more on penalties and more punitive measures, Mr. Speaker, and I'm very concerned about that. I indicated earlier that, and so did other members in this debate, what the underlying sort of issues are for many people who are on our streets. You know, there was a CBC reporter, actually Jackie Torrance. She's a wonderful writer and performer, a humorist in many respects, and she's been on the CBC radio in the morning filling in for one of the permanent hosts on Information Morning when Elizabeth Logan was on vacation. And her name is Jackie Torrance, and many people here will know Jackie and certainly know of her work because she is quite well known and quite prolific in her work. And at the end of her time at CBC, this issue was here on the floor of the House, and she went off after doing the morning show with her tape recorder over to the intersection at the Willow Tree and to interview the people who were panhandling at that intersection. And she came back then the next day, and I listened to her piece, and it was very well done, and it was really quite interesting, Mr. Chair. I'm sure if you heard it, you would think so as well. She said, you know, that like many people, she had this idea that perhaps the people who were at the intersection really didn't need to be at the intersection. They had lots of other alternatives available to them that would be much more useful as a way to support themselves, getting employment, and being gainfully in the workforce rather than being bothersome and, as Gloria McCluskey is quoted in one of the newspaper articles on Bill 7 says, a nuisance. And she ended up speaking with several people who, I don't know if routinely would be the right word, but she met with several people who have been known to be at the intersection at Quinpool and Roby. One of them was a woman who is a woman with a disability and a mother, and who has a very, very difficult time making ends meet with the very limited amount of income that she had to work with on a monthly basis. And as well, she interviewed a young man who is single, no dependents. And he similarly had a rather complicated story that was much more serious in terms of the challenges he had in his life and the inability to be able to get an adequate income from the kinds of menial jobs that were available to him. And subsequently, he raised an additional small amount, and we're talking really small amounts of money as well. This idea that people who are squeegeeing or panhandling are rolling in the dough at the end of, you know, standing outside in the worst weather conditions, and often having a fair amount of abuse heaped on them from members of the motoring public, because I've witnessed this. It's hard to believe that people would really believe that people are there, Mr. Speaker, because it's an easy road to hoe. It's a very difficult thing to have to do, and the amounts of money that people might have at the end of the day, you know, $15, you know, if they're really lucky, maybe $30, is really, I think, the outcome of what insight Jackie Torrance provided through her very interesting and informative piece on the radio. So, as I said when this bill first came to the floor, the people who are in these situations tend to be people who are living in poverty. Very often, the young people are people who have been through, quite often, the child welfare system. I think I saw one report that said 70% of the homeless people in our communities tend to have been former wards of child welfare organizations. And certainly, if you look at street kids internationally, you'll find a lot of street kids are kids who have either no families, families that rejected them, families where they have been abused both physically and sexually and psychologically. The problems that people subsequently have as a result they can be very deep-seated, Mr. Chair, and they require our understanding, and they require a healthy intervention, not a punitive intervention. Mr. Chair, I look at the work of many of the community-based organizations in my constituency. Mr. Chair, as you know, I represent the North End of Halifax. I have Adsum House, which is an emergency shelter for women and children. I was a founding board member for that house. I did the research that set up that house. I did the research that showed that 16 to 19-year-old young people, young women in this province had no place to go, and many were on the street. That was back in 1970, probably 1980, the early 80s. The other shelter I have in my constituency is the Metro Turning Point, Mr. Speaker, or Mr. Chair. Metro Turning Point has been around for a very, very long time. Metro Turning Point has many homeless people, many people who actually work, but with incomes that are inadequate to find affordable housing, and people who have serious physical and mental health disabilities. I have an organization in my constituency called the ARC. The ARC is an organization that works with many of the street kids and works specifically with a lot of the squeegee kids. And they're one of the women who works in this program, runs this program, Dorothy Patterson, is probably one of the most eloquent and articulate spokespeople as a community helper on behalf of these young people. She knows more about the realities that these people face than I've ever known. She's out there day to day doing this work, and she sees these young people as they sometimes are transient from our communities. They come from our rural communities into the city. They come from other provinces, or they can, in fact, be from the local area as well, Mr. Speaker. And we need to work with people like Dorothy to understand what are the features of people's lives and how do we intervene productively to make a difference, not punitively, Mr. Speaker, because punitive measures rarely work. We can fine people, we can levy fines, we can pick people up and fine them and fine them and fine them. And these are people who don't have the resources to pay these fines. They wouldn't be there in the first place if they had money in their pockets. So eventually, when people have been fined a number of times, what's going to happen? What's going to happen? Are we going to throw these people in the correctional facility out in Burnside and you know, let them be there for a while at extraordinary cost to the taxpayer? You know, this makes no sense. It makes absolutely no sense. The way we're proceeding. So, Mr. Chair, this particular clause is a very superficial understanding of what causes these conditions, and it's our view in the NDP caucus that the government needs to be dealing with the root causes, which are affordability, safe housing, affordable heat, accessible buildings and transportation, quality universal child care, a child welfare system that is there to support people, particularly as they get to the point where their wardship is about to be terminated, in their training needs, in their educational needs in the school system, and in particular, Mr. Chair, there are a very large group of people in our province who have disabilities. Nova Scotia has one of the highest rates, if not the highest rate. I see the Minister of Community Services shaking her head in agreement. Nova Scotia has the highest rate of disability in the country. And we have many, many people who are disabled who don't receive any financial support from the Department of Community Services because they received the federal Canada Pension Disability Program because they were in the workforce until they became disabled. They were paying into the Canada Pension Plan. They became permanently disabled. They're eligible for Canada Pension Disability. And by virtue of the amount...
Order, please. The chatter is certainly getting a lot more than we're able to hear the speaker. So maybe I could ask members to either take their discussions outside the chamber so we can all hear the honourable member speak. Thank you. The honourable member for Halifax-Needham.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I very much appreciate your assistance. Yeah, so we have a high proportion, the highest proportion of people with disabilities in our province of any other province. And as I was saying, many people receive Canada Pension Disability, and their Canada Pension is just slightly too high to make them eligible for any form of provincial assistance. And every time there's an election, when I go door to door in my constituency, you know, I'm always struck at the high numbers of people, particularly women, but not only women, men and women who live on extraordinarily small amounts of pension disability income. And I'm sure you would know this, Mr. Chair, having been a member here for a long time and having been in many, many elections, and I would not doubt for a moment that you would have met in your career many people in a similar situation. Now, people who get CPP disability do not have a drug plan. The Canada Pension Disability Program has no drug plan. Very rarely do people with disabilities have zero drug needs. They often, if you have a disability, if you've had a stroke or heart attacks, you know, whatever, various conditions that make it impossible for you to be in the workforce permanently, then chances are you have to take some kind of medication. No drug plan. You may not have high-cost drug needs. They may be modest. They may be $120 a month. But if your disability pension is $600 a month, $120 is a lot of money. So I think we really need to, excuse me, I think we really need to appreciate the problems that put people on the street, especially with disabilities, especially when they have disabilities. It's very difficult. I think one of the most serious problems that we see with people out in our community are people who are looking for support so they can get themselves a meal. Thanks very much, Graham. People who are looking for support so they can get themselves a meal. And many people think that with food banks and with soup kitchens, there is no need for people to receive an abundance of wealth here, water, thank you, that there is no need for people to be begging in our community. They don't know how food banks work. They don't know that you can't go to the food bank every week. They don't know that most food bank policies is once every 3 months. The minister says they don't bring you water. Thank you. But this is a very serious problem for people, you know. If you have inadequate income, you have no drug plan. You get sick and you need medication, and you take the medication out of your food budget, and then you have no money for food. You go to the food bank, but you're only allowed there once every 3 months. What they provide you when you go is 3 days' supply of food. Then you will find yourself, and the folks we see at the intersections are those folks who have experienced a serious crisis, and they literally do not have money for food because they've spent it. They've spent it on drugs. They've spent it to take a taxi to the emergency department because that's the only way they could get there. You know, people who have resources are able to put away money for a rainy day, or they have good credit. They're able, if a crisis arises, they don't take their grocery money to deal with their crisis. But people who live so close to the line, they frequently are in a situation where that's precisely what happens. And you know what, Mr. Chair? I'd be very surprised if there's any member of this legislature who doesn't know that. And why do we know that? We know that because we're the ones that people come to every week for advocacy with the Department of Community Services or Department of Health when those things happen. I've been here for 10 years almost, and I spend 80% of my time advocating for people in my constituency who get into a crisis when they have inadequate resources, no credit, no savings, no income, or small income, and they've got a crisis, and they can't get through the community services hoops and bureaucracy. Sometimes I'm amazed that we don't have a heck of a lot more people on our streets begging and squeegeeing. And the only reason we don't is that we have phenomenal organizations in the community, church groups, that are providing support, clothes, food, heating oil, and the Department of Community Services and their workers who, you know, when we advocate and we make the compelling case and we work with the caseworkers and we try to find a workable solution and we take the department's policy and we stretch it and we pull it and we stand it on its head and we do all of the things we try to do to get somebody to fit into those programs. That's the way many people who live close to the line survive. But inevitably, Mr. Chair, there are people who fall outside. They fall outside of our ability to be able to stretch and pull that policy. They fall outside the ability of the churches and the charities to provide the support that's required. And sometimes, Mr. Chair, there are people who just have too much pride or too much independence to subject themselves one more time to what can be not only a frustrating process, but a pretty degrading process sometimes as well, where you've got to bear everything about your life in that process. You have to really you open the door and there's nothing that can't be examined in terms of determining whether or not you're going to get any assistance from the system. And for some people, it's a lot easier to take a pail and a bucket or a piece of cardboard and a magic marker and go stand at the corner of Romy and Quinpool and ask for help, for a bite to eat, and a cup of coffee. And it's as simple as that, Mr. Chair. And those are the people that Bill 7, Clause 13, wants to fine. And every one of us knows that. Every one of us knows that in this chamber. Anybody who has been an MLA for a year cannot possibly not know that that's the reality. And so I'm totally at a loss to understand how intelligent people with experience and a will to work for the people of this province can in good conscience bring forward a piece of legislation with this particular clause in it and support this particular clause. I'm at a loss. I've been here with colleagues here in the NDP, but in all parties, and I know that this job can be a difficult job, and that people get into this business because they want to be able to do things on behalf of the province. And there isn't anybody here that doesn't care about people in poverty and doesn't want to see poverty reduced and doesn't want to be part of that process of doing things to prevent and mitigate misery, disadvantage, hunger, all of those things. But yet, in good conscience, some people are prepared to allow this particular clause to go forward. And all I'm saying, Mr. Chair, is I would really like people to reflect on who it is that's at the intersections, why are they there, what are we going to do to realistically address the problems that put people at those intersections in a positive way, in a way that responds to their human needs as human beings, rather than criminalizing them and further disadvantaging them. Can you imagine once somebody has a criminal record, what that's going to do to their ability to be able to change their lives around? How easy is it going to be for any of these people to get into a training program, to get employment after they've spent a few weeks in a correctional program? You know, we have to think about the implications of what we're doing here in this bill. And Mr. Chair, you can't say on the one hand, we're all for reducing poverty and we're going to put together a big work group and we're going to develop a strategy and it's going to be wonderful. And at the same time, you take the people who are the most disadvantaged, and you treat them in this way, fines, eventually jail time, a criminal record. You know, you can't do that and reconcile those two positions. They're completely contradictory. They're completely contradictory, Mr. Chair, completely. So I would plea with my colleagues here in the legislature to stand back and think about the implications of what we're doing with this clause. We really, really should defeat this clause. And then we could have a discussion, I think, about a true poverty reduction strategy that we all could be committed to, we all could move forward on, we all could feel good about, and we all could have some buy-in around. Mr. Chair, I'm very troubled.
Thank you. I will now recognize the Honourable the Minister of Health on an introduction.
Thank you very much, Chair, and I thank the member opposite for allowing me time to do this introduction. In the East Gallery today, we have Monsieur Paul Galland and Jim Morrow. They're both members of the Nova Scotia Arts and Culture Partnership Council. I know they're here meeting with members of the legislature, and I'd like to welcome them to the legislature. Bienvenue, vous êtes tout le temps bienvenue ici, and I'd like to give them to rise and receive the warm welcome of the House.
Thank you. The honourable member for Halifax Needham.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, the most troubling aspect, I think, of this bill for me and this whole process for me is that, you know, many of us here in this legislature as legislators have actually been working on issues around poverty and disadvantage for quite some time. The Standing Committee on Community Services, an all-party committee, back in 1998 did hearings around the province around reforming the social welfare system in Nova Scotia. The current Standing Committee on Community Services, chaired by my colleague, the member from Dartmouth South Portland Valley, have held forums on poverty, several day forums, and people came and made really interesting and insightful presentations. And there are many, many suggestions for actions, and there were more than 100 recommendations that came out of that particular forum for very concrete things that could be done to address poverty in the province and close some of those gaps with respect to employment supports and income assistance, as well as address a whole variety of needs for people who live in poverty. You know, these are the people who most understand the issues, and because they deal with them every day and they work with people who are in poverty. And, you know, I think that it's a real failure to bring forward legislation that isn't informed by that work, that incredible body of work. And if we leave here, I think at this time of the year, we all leave here to spend time with family and friends, people we love, people we care about. We live in a society that has grown more and more affluent in many ways. My mom and dad talk about, you know, what Christmas was like when they were children. And they didn't have a lot, but they certainly valued whatever it was they got. If they got an orange, it was a very big deal. And, you know, and many of us, in fact, may ourselves remember those days. We didn't live an affluent life, and today we look at our children and our nieces and nephews and grandchildren and those around us, and they have so much, and it's so disposable in so many ways. And we've kind of lost touch, people say, with the meaning of this time of year. And we become so immersed in the commercial aspects of the season rather than really looking at what's important in life, which is the kind of relationships you have with those around you. And for many, many people, perhaps the people who are at the intersections in this province are nameless, faceless people who we would rather not see there. We just would want them to go away. They're a nuisance, and not only that, they don't really fit into this modern day world, this world where we just, are so fast-paced, and we're so bent on consuming the latest fad or the ast taste or the latest thing that comes along. But, Mr. Chair, I would argue that all of us here should take a step back and think about the time of the year, the responsibility that we have to not only people who we know, but people who we don't know. I think we need to think about people who are complete strangers to us and what kind of responsibilities we have to improve their lives. And we have a greater responsibility, I would argue, than most, because we are lawmakers. We have the ability to define what are the standards of behavior and responsibility and accountability in our society, and what are the standards that we use when we look at people who don't fit in, who we're not going to permit to fit in. And sadly, Clause 13 is further marginalizing, further handicapping people in our society. Perhaps they're perfect strangers to us, but I want to say, having worked as a social worker, many of those people on the street, they could be your son, they could be your daughter, they could be your granddaughter someday. Many of us are maybe a mental health disorder away from losing it all and being out there looking for someone to connect with and understand what it is we're going through and responding with caring and humanity, not with a fine and not with incarceration, Mr. Chair. So with that, I will take my place, and I would really urge members to defeat Clause 13 in the spirit of the season.
Are there further speakers? The Honourable the Minister of Transportation and Infrastructure Renewal.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the member opposite for some of the concerns and issues she brought before the House. And there are some things that she said, Mr. Speaker, I agree with, and some that I don't. But one thing I do want to point out, Mr. Speaker, the Speaker, the honourable member, actually missed the point of the whole issue, and she never once talked about the safety of these individuals who are placing themselves in jeopardy. Mr. Speaker, I'd use the analogy of, as a police officer, kids playing in the street, playing hockey in the street, where there was a lot of high traffic, and we as police would move them. We didn't move them because we didn't like hockey. We moved them because we wanted them to be safe. Mr. Speaker, not once, not last hour of discussion, did I hear the honourable member talk about safety. And you're right, it could be my son or daughter, my granddaughter, and I would hope that somebody who has the ability to make laws in this province would do what they could to protect those people and make them safe. Mr. Speaker, she mentioned about, several times during the course of her conversation, there's several lawyers in the honourable member's caucus. And she mentioned several times about criminalizing, and this will give a criminal record. It's absolutely false. Read the legislation. Read it. It has nothing to do with giving anybody a criminal record, and it will not. Well, read the legislation, Mr. Speaker. There's several lawyers, Mr. Speaker, and obviously they have not read the legislation, or at least they haven't read it with the intent to see what it was actually about, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the other thing mentioned was that No one has come forward to support this. Again, Mr. Speaker, they either have not listened to law amendments, have not read media, listened to the media. Several people, in fact, Mr. Speaker, the police have been front and center on this, have asked this government to do something in the last couple of years. The Halifax Regional Municipality, Mr. Speaker, have asked this government to do something. Mr. Speaker, I'll table this. On June 14, 2005, Halifax Regional Municipality passed a resolution to ask this province to adopt safer streets, which included what we're actually doing here tonight. And Mr. Speaker, that motion passed 21 for, 3 against. 21 for were Mayor Kelly, Deputy Mayor Gauche, Councillor Stretch, Snow, Hensby, McAvoy, Younger, Karsten, Kent, Wiley, Murphy, Sloan, Utek and Fougere, Walker, Hum, Mosier, Adams, John, Rankin, and Mead. You know, Mr. Speaker, 21 people out of the municipal council asked us to do this. 3 voted against it, Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Speaker, there's lots of evidence here to support this. And, Mr. Speaker, it is about safety. And people can get up and they can rail away, Mr. Speaker, to an audience to try to talk about every issue this province is facing. And that's fine, Mr. Speaker. If that's the intent, and that's the road they want to go on. But I'll tell you, Mr. Speaker, I'm very proud to be able to say that I've introduced the amendments to the Motor Vehicle Act to protect people. Mr. Speaker, it is Christmas time. The streets are getting slippery. Traffic's getting fast. It's getting darker at night. And I've seen people at that corner, Mr. Speaker, and it's a matter of time before someone's struck with a truck mirror, run over by a vehicle, slide under a vehicle, injured, and worse, Mr. Speaker, killed. And I'll tell you, Mr. Speaker, if this amendment was adopted, at least, Mr. Speaker, I'd go home knowing I did the very best I could to protect citizens of this province. And, Mr. Speaker, it is about road safety. If you read this, Mr. Speaker, it's about people being on the road where vehicles are intended to travel, the paved portion of the highway, not intended for pedestrians. Crosswalks are for pedestrians, Mr. Speaker, and we've all talked in this House about doing what we can to protect particularly people in crosswalks and pedestrians. And, Mr. Speaker, this is completely what they're intending to do here tonight, contrary to what they stand in this House and tell us to do on a daily basis, to make the streets in this province and the crosswalks safe as possible. Yet they stand here and advocate to allow people to walk amongst traffic. Mr. Speaker, it doesn't make any sense. It does not make any sense. If someone in the back there, Mr. Speaker, can stand and justify that, I challenge them to do it. Stand and tell me you would tell your son or daughter to go out in the street and walk amongst traveling traffic with a green light, that you would say it's okay to do it. I challenge you to stand and say it. If you do, good for you. I'm not. And, Mr. Speaker, I'm proud this government has the fortitude to bring this legislation forward to protect the people in Halifax Regional Municipality, Mr. Speaker, because that's where it's a huge issue. And I'm proud to do it, Mr. Speaker, and I will definitely, Mr. Speaker, vote against the amendment.
Thank you. The Honourable, the Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, Mr. Speaker, the other day I was in my constituency, driving along in my car, and up the hill and approaching my car in the middle of the road were members of the Fleet Diving Unit here in Halifax, who are doing a great job raising money for charities in this province, and that's where they were, Mr. Speaker. They were taken right out in the road, raising money in order to do the good work that they do. So, you know, this amendment doesn't do away with all people's ability to be able to do that. It picks on and scapegoats a very finite group of people. That's what it actually does, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. The Honourable Member for Halifax-Needham.
Thank you very much. Well, I was so inspired by the Minister of Transportation, I decided I'd have another little go at this because he obviously missed the point of some of the things that I was saying, or perhaps I didn't say enough. So I will go again. And the the member from Yarmouth always misses the point, as far as I can tell. So we won't travel on that one. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Chair, let me say this, that if this were about safety, Mr. Speaker, the police could rely on a section 127.2, which makes it illegal for a pedestrian to obstruct traffic by walking in a roadway where sidewalks are provided. Mr. Speaker, perhaps the former Minister of Justice could consult with some of the lawyers that he worked with, or in fact some of the police, to find out why they're not already using powers that exist in the law if in fact there's such a lack of safety in the community. Mr. Speaker, you know, this comes from lawyers who say those provisions are already there. You know, what are we doing with it? We're introducing fines when there are provisions that already exist to deal with safety issues, and the minister knows that full well, number one. Number two, I just want to correct the minister with respect to saying that, putting words in my mouth. I certainly did not say that there were no presentations at law amendments in support of this bill. And I am very well aware of the fact that the chief of police from HRM was here and made a presentation. I have all kinds of respect for Chief Beasley. I've had the privilege of meeting with him on more than one occasion around issues of crime in the community. He is somebody who has invested an enormous amount of human capital in the north end of Halifax. His officers are well respected, and they have done not only phenomenal policing work in my community, but they do a lot of really good community work. I've had the privilege of working with one of his officers who was a mentor on a mentoring program that I started for young girls to prevent young girls from becoming involved in criminal activity. And we've had many, many occasions for officers from his force to come into our community, plant community gardens, build community rinks, and do all kinds of worthy works. That's not to say that I would not have some disagreement with some things he might want, nor he with things that I would think or would want for my community. And I think, in fairness, Mr. Chair, I would say that he and I have a very, very good respect for each other and a strong working relationship, which I would hope would continue into the future. The point I was making, Mr. Chair, with respect to presentations at law amendments were that, in fact, there were groups, like safety council groups, that came forward that did not specifically support this clause, and they were asked. They were asked by my colleagues who sat on the Law Amendments Committee about that. And so I think it's not fair to take somebody's words out of context and distort them in any way here in this committee. And I'm certainly not prepared to allow that to occur and have the record go unchallenged, Mr. Chair. And so I really want that to be reflected here. I think those are primarily the points I would make at this time, and I understand that we can talk as often as we like during Committee of the Whole until a certain amount of time goes. So I'd be happy to hear from anybody else, and maybe it'll inspire me to go again, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Are there further speakers on clause number 13? Okay. The motion before the committee is, shall clause 13 carry? A recorded vote? Recorded vote? Ring the bells, please. Ring the bells, and we'll determine as we recess for how long. Thank you.